Hello, my name is Sue Barrett, and I come to you from the electorate of Goldstein in Melbourne, which is on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I welcome you all to an important conversation about the evolving landscape of Australian politics, where we'll delve into the crucial role of the Senate and the power of collaboration and consensus building. The Senate, often considered the House of Review, has seen a recent surge in independent voices like David Pocock, challenging the traditional two-party dominance. This shift is prompting us to reimagine how politics is done better, both within the Senate and between the upper and lower houses of the Australian Parliament. Today, our focus isn't on what the Senate does, but rather how it functions effectively, and we have the privilege of hearing from two remarkable individuals who are at the forefront of this transformation. David Pocock, the Independent Senator for the ACT, and Monique Ryan, the Independent Member for Kooyong in the House of Representatives. We'll examine what good politics looks like, and in this context, we can build consensus, hold the government accountable, and ultimately serve the Australian people better. We'll also tackle some public concerns about the Senate, addressing perceptions of horse trading and anxieties around minority governments. Our goal is to leave you with a deeper understanding of the Senate's vital role in our democracy and how a more collaborative approach can lead to better policies, stronger governance, and better outcomes for all Australians. In short, we'll reimagine what's possible when we prioritise good governance, community values, and a collaborative spirit within the Senate and the House of Representatives. It's a conversation that holds the potential to reshape our understanding of politics and the way we do democracy better in Australia. It's about people-powered politics. So welcome, everyone. What I'd like to do is kick off my first question to David. David, as an independent senator, how has the increasing presence of independent voices in the Senate changed its dynamics and its role in holding government accountable? And are you able to provide us with any examples?
Well, hey, Sue, and hello, everyone tuning in. Particularly to the Canberrans. I know there's a bunch of Canberrans watching this. So thanks so much for your support. I don't know how it's changed, to be honest. I've only been there in 2 years. What I have seen is having more normal people who are, in many ways, quite reluctantly in there. They've been asked by their community to represent them. They're accountable to their community. That alone makes a big difference when you're asking questions in question time. You're not trying to score some sort of political point. You're often genuinely trying to find something out or making a point that the government isn't acting on something. So I think there's huge value in having more independence, a bigger crossbench. Obviously, there's the balance of power in the Senate when the opposition opposes things. And what we've seen time and time again is when it comes to policy issues, the coalition oppose things. And that's where the crossbench can have some, I guess, real leverage in increasing ambition when it comes to climate policy or adding extra measures around accountability and transparency when it comes to other measures, or often just finding a more middle ground when it comes to things like industrial relations or other contentious policies. But the other thing you see in the Senate, which is really, really, I don't know why I'm surprised, but every time it's pretty astonishing to watch, is when it comes to issues of transparency or lobbying, ministerial diaries, any of these things, you'll have, or even extra tax from our gas resources, actually getting a good return from our gas exports. What you'll see is almost the entire crossbench voting or being outvoted by the major parties. Labor, Liberals, the Nationals, they sit together, and you'll have the Greens, Independents, even One Nation voting against them. And the major parties use their power to kind of squash anything that is inconvenient for them. So I think it is a threat. It is a threat to them to have someone in there who's not in there to climb the climb the party ladder. They're in there to make a difference for their community, and hopefully over time we'll see the crossbench grow, and there'll be more and more power that is representing people.
Very interesting. They clearly have their own little club, don't they? And we're actually sort of messing with it in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mon, from your perspective in the House of Representatives, how has the rise of independent senators actually impacted your interactions with the upper house? And has it changed the way you might approach legislation and engagement with the Senate?
Oh, thanks, Sue. And well, greetings to everyone from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. I'm very glad to be with you all today. Incredible numbers online today, which is a testament to the increasing strength of the community movement. Obviously, I'm also new to Parliament in 2022 and haven't been part of that dynamic before. But what I think I and other members of the crossbench in the House have realised over the last couple of years is our increasing ability to work with the colleagues in the upper house to facilitate change. And that's the independents, but also Jackie and Tammy and the Greens as well. Even I did find myself once on the same issue as the same page as Malcolm Roberts. I think both of us were quite surprised to find ourselves on that page, but we did something useful together. Yeah, and so basically what we're learning as independents is how to move every lever that we can move in order to pragmatically affect change on the things that matter to us. And part of being able to do that is to work effectively with the Senate. And I've had a couple of examples already where I've worked with the Greens or with David in particular to get things onto the agenda, to keep them elevated, because things move so quickly. Often it's hard to do that. You have an issue that you're really trying to draw people's attention to, but things move so quickly. Sometimes in Canberra, it's really hard to do that. Whereas if we can do it as things go between the two houses, that can be useful. Well, it's just basically coming at things from different angles, but working pragmatically. It does require a certain amount of trust. Sometimes it requires a little bit of generosity, because there might be something that you've worked on really hard yourself, but then you give it over to someone and basically trust your baby to them to take it forward and to get the result that you want. But it feels powerful. And as David said, the more of us that there are and the more opportunities that we have to demonstrate to people our ability to affect that change, then I think the more that people will trust the model, and hopefully the bigger that model will get.
Well, we need to be the change that people can see, don't we? So they actually can see a real distinct difference to how politics has been done in the past. David, what are the practical ways in which the lower house independents and the independent senators can actually work together to actually deliver better outcomes for the Australian people? So what would be some of the unique opportunities and challenges of this kind of cross-chamber collaboration? Because this is what we want to see. We want to be the change that they want to see.
I've been really surprised how separate the Senate and the House are. You can sometimes go for a week without really seeing other people or even really thinking about it. It's so, you're so engrossed in what you're doing. But I think there's some real opportunities and value in the lower house and the Senate working together. An example would be Mon has a bill to do with lobbying and transparency and trying to fix that up. Obviously in the lower house with the government, that's incredibly inconvenient for them, and I assume they don't like that bill. I was able to get a Senate inquiry up in the Senate, negotiating with the government over a few things. They watered it down quite a bit, but we still managed to use it to show just how bad our lobbying laws are, and I think really make the case. There was overwhelming evidence that we should clean it up, that ministerial diaries should be released monthly or at least quarterly. And the major parties' number one recommendation was for another inquiry. So you kind of know you've got them when they recommend another inquiry and kick it down the roads. I guess that's one thing. There are a number of bills that will get introduced into the Senate and the House. And then one of the things we've seen with the government, I think it's starting to change, but early on, regardless of how good the amendments were in the lower house, how sensible they were, the government was basically saying, that's cute, but we're going to wait till the Senate to make any changes. And so it was really about actually talking to lower house independents about all the work that they'd put into amendments, and then negotiating with government and saying, well, these are good amendments, these should pass in the Senate, and using that balance of power to get good outcomes. The thing that you see is, whilst there's lots of differences between all the independents, when you're actually listening to your community on any sort of policy that comes through, you're often hearing similar themes from community, from experts. And so a lot of the amendments are often trying to fix similar aspects of a bill. And so I think there's real power in having both the Senate crossbench and the lower house saying, hey, these are big issues with this bill that need to be fixed. To the government's credit, I think they've got a lot better. And with the NDIS bill, Mon managed to get a number of really good amendments to improve that bill. So I think there's that collaboration, but it is a challenge because everyone's short-staffed, everyone's flat out. But I think that's what it takes to have that sort of pressure on in both houses on the government.
So are you saying that even if something doesn't get passed, by raising the visibility of this, getting it aired in Parliament, actually helps, shine sunlight on key areas that the public should know about?
Yeah, I think there's huge power in that constant light when you're raising issues of integrity and vested interests and the way that appointments are made. But then I think also on the big issues, if you look at what the electorate of Indi has given us in having a National Anti-Corruption Commission, that took Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes a decade to get one of the major parties to the point where they were willing to do it. And at the start, my understanding is, as they said, you're dreaming. And so I think that constant pressure will lead to change. Something like lobbying, I see it as inevitable. It's just a matter of time before Australians wake up to the fact that we have this lobbying system that is an absolute joke. 2,000 lobbyists cruising around Parliament House who no one knows who they are. It's not a good system. And I think the more that we can bang on about these things, the more they'll become election issues and be changed.
Mon, have you got anything to add to this particular topic?
I completely agree with Dave. And I think, there are times where you bang your head against the wall and think you're not making any progress. But it is true that we are keeping things in people's minds. We're drawing attention to them. Sometimes it's a question of drip, 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 drip. And then eventually you get the result that you need. Again, David and I haven't been there before, but we do get told a lot that just having us there and that the tenor of discussion and debate is different within the House and the Senate. It's very, the dynamics of interaction, the interfaces between the government and the crossbench, at least in the House, are very different to the way that the government interfaces with the Greens or with the opposition. It feels much more constructive because it's not, I know we're going to get onto this, it's not purely transactional. It's much more, and it's not ideological. It's quite pragmatic and sensible. And it feels like a much more productive model in the long term than the traditional party-based interactions.
Well, I know when you read comments about, question time and things like that, most of the public are pretty shocked at how that operates. But since the independents, and the community-backed independents have come in, as you say, it has changed the tenure of how we debate things and discuss things in a more civil and productive manner from the sounds of it.
To some extent, it's not always civil or productive, but when the government has a question, it's a Dorothy Dixer, and so everyone relaxes and doesn't listen. And then when the opposition has a question in the House, it's often that they're having a go at Andrew Giles, bang, 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 or they're having a go at someone else, bang, 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 and they're not actually trying to get information, just trying to have a go and make a score a political point. Whereas when someone from the crossbench stands up, you don't know if it's going to be about water in the Murray-Darling, or it's going to be about violence against women, or about Beetaloo, or about Medicare. It could be anything. And people actually go quiet and listen. then the opposition will yell at us if we say something that they find annoying, and they often do. But, at least people actually turn and listen, because there's some uncertainty, but there's also a potential for us to actually address a matter of real interest and concern, which is often not the case with the other questions asked during question time.
Right. Well, which leads me to my next question to you, Mon, is that in your experience, how can an approach of collaboration and consensus building versus the, conflict that we often see, so collaboration and consensus building between the House of Reps and Senate actually lead to better policies and better governance in Australia?
Well, I think the two examples Dave's given are my sort of perfect examples at this point in time. I did have an early win early on with the Greens with changes on a cross provision on some legal stuff, and that was a good one. But more recently, the Clean Up Politics Act that I put up as a private member's bill, Dave got the Senate inquiry, that is not going away. And as far as I'm concerned, as long as I'm in Parliament, that is on the agenda. And if we have a balance of power situation after the next federal election, that will be the one thing which for me will be the line in the stand. And it's a very powerful thing. And the more social license we get from this, because every time Dave and I speak about this, people do get outraged. People don't know about it, they don't understand. And when you tell them about it, they say, well, that can't be right. There can't be 2,000 people walking the halls of Parliament. It can't be right that every minister, every energy resources minister since 2001 has left Parliament and gone to work in the industry, the fossil fuel industry. That can't be right. People get outraged. And so you do build this social license. People become aware of these issues. But even more recently, this NDIS legislation, we know we need changes to the NDIS. The costs are blowing out. There's structural issues with it. The government's put up a bill. The bill is not the worst, but there's lots of things about it which have caused great concern in the disability community. There's just not enough detail there. People are a bit nervous about it. The disability community and legal experts have come to us with a whole lot of changes and suggestions. The Senate inquiry only reported on the 20th. It's all happening very, very quickly. But we got amendments up in the House, and I ended up with COVID, so Kate moved them for me, and we worked with the minister, we worked with the agency, and we worked with the department. Very, very hard over a relatively brief period of time with some stuff which is really kind of complex and difficult, but really productively. And then as soon as it went through the House, Dave's taken it up. He and his team are working on it. Again, we're working with disability agencies and experts on it, and we will improve the legislation, and we'll do that together. It's not easy because we've got all these other pieces of legislation we're also trying to get our heads around and work on at the same time. But it feels powerful, and I think it's a great model for what we can do.
Well, this leads me then back to you, David. Could you actually describe any of the tools, processes or mechanisms that the Senate uses or possibly could adopt to actually foster this better collaborative approach and consensus building approach to doing, policy and getting legislation passed effectively?
The Senate committee process, I think, is a really useful and powerful tool. So you have legislative committees which look at legislation that's coming through, and that's a really good opportunity to make the case for changes or to point out what's wrong with the bill. But then you have references committees where you can actually try and get the numbers in the Senate to have an inquiry looking at something like the Middle Arm petrochemical hub up in Darwin and really try and understand why are we giving $1.5 billion that for all intents and purposes seem to be a handout to the gas industry. So I think that's a powerful thing. There's obviously Senate estimates, which again is another way to really hold the government to account on spending and programs and how taxpayer money is being spent on all sorts of things that don't make sense. In terms of what could improve collaboration, I still think question time is an absolute joke. And unlike the House, there's a lot of, most of the Senate crossbench, if you don't have a question that day, not a lot of us go because I think there's far more productive things to be doing. Dorothy Dixes are just the worst, a total waste of time. So I don't know, there's probably some stuff there, but I can't see the major parties wanting to do much there. A big challenge is resourcing and being able to get across legislation early enough to then really work on amendments and get in the minister's ears about it. And I guess that's where you've just got to make do. And I'm incredibly lucky to have an amazing small team, and then a remarkable group of Canberrans who volunteer in the electorate office, volunteer at Parliament House, help out with different pieces of legislation, and you really have to rely on people and kind of have roundtables and try and get across things very, very quickly. So I don't know. There's probably a lot that could be done in politics to build more consensus. But I'll end by saying that I think there is actually a lot more good faith work between parliamentarians than most Australians would think. It's pretty unfortunate that most of what we see on the news are clips from Question Time, which again I don't think reflect what actually happens in the background. And that's one of the things I love as an independent is working with the crossbench on things, working with the government on things, and then working with the opposition on other policy issues or inquiries. So there's a lot of scope to do that if you don't get caught in your sort of little ideological space.
So you're saying that there is sort of a glimmer of hope, that there is some decent collaboration actually happening across all of the different people that you engage with, so that despite the performative nature of Question Time and the kind of, sound bites that the media want, people are actually doing the work. I mean, obviously we know our community independents are, but people are actually doing the work to try and pass better legislation for our country.
Yeah, there's some really good people in, I think, like any workplace or anywhere, there's good people everywhere. I see them often being constrained by their party line. I think that's a big problem, and it's certainly not for me. I couldn't do that. But yeah, on committees and at estimates, you're often working with members from the major parties, really trying to get to the bottom of things.
Okay, so in a sense, what community independents are doing and is actually helping them do better legislation without them actually having to offend their party. So are we kind of the excuse for them to actually do better work?
I think that's a big part of it, is actually pushing the parties to do better. And one of the things I see as the value of community independence is forcing the major parties to go back to the people that they should be representing. And I think as we see more and more independents running in electorates across the country, even candidates who don't win, I think, are playing such an important role in our democracy in raising issues that are important to Australians, and in doing so, forcing the major parties to start to address the issues that they can simply kind of kick down the road or sweep under the rug.
Okay, very interesting. So, Mon, obviously you're a key advocate for community-backed collaborative politics. How can we build a culture of trust and shared purpose between the House and the Senate, even when dealing with diverse viewpoints, as David has been sharing?
Well, I think it's a body of work that's kind of in progress, but we've begun to demonstrate how it is possible. I would love to work more with the opposition, actually, because let's face it, they've got some quite good numbers. Not great numbers, but quite good numbers in the House and the Senate. I've gone back to them on multiple occasions, and most recently with the NDIS legislation, I went to Michael Zucker and said, "What are you thinking? Can we talk about this? Because I've got concerns. I'm interested in what yours might be." We are to some extent constrained by their political. The fact that I think their first thought is politics and their second thought is policy. And that's really frustrating at times, because that's not where we're coming from, actually. But I think we will continue to do that, and hopefully, I hope that over time we will be able to shift the dial. If there were more independents in the House and the Senate after the next federal election, the Liberals and the Nationals would have to work with us more. They just would. And we would be able to be a more effective opposition in that setting. Or, if it wasn't a majority government with either of the major parties, either of those parties is going to have to work with us more, and we will force them to shift the dial. The other thing I would just add to what David was saying in terms of us putting things on the agenda is we also have, and we've done this multiple times already. It's a bit frustrating at times actually, but we've given the government social license to act on things that probably have been thinking about, or thinking maybe, that we've sort of elevated and sort of forced them to act on. And a good example of that was the stage 3 tax cuts, where David and I, Don Lee, a number of other people at the end of last year came out and said we did not think that in their then form that they were ideal. We thought that there were some real concerns there, not only in terms of them being really inflationary, but also in terms of their impact being not directed to those people who needed them most. And we talked about that, and I think the government thought everyone was just going to say, no, we want statutory tax cuts. And lots of people from communities like us said, actually, we're kind of okay with that because we can see that that might not be the best use of that money. And eventually that decision was made. Now, the government might argue that they were going to make that decision all along, who knows? But the reality is that we did give them social license for that. And it's a bit frustrating where sometimes, you think that they want us to float a balloon and see if it gets shot down or not. And if it doesn't, then they can take credit for it. But it is, whether or not it's annoying to us, which it can be, it still serves a useful purpose for the country. And that's, I think, another contribution that we do make.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you. David, we've kind of already started touching on this subject, but how do you think we can change the public's perception of the Senate from a place of what often people refer to as horse trading to one that actually values consensus and compromise for the greater good of the country?
I think we're seeing a lot more of that in this Senate. My approach has certainly been to take each piece of policy on its merits and use whatever leverage I have to improve that policy and get good outcomes. And yes, sometimes I've then asked for things that maybe don't directly relate to that policy, but I think are an important part of what's missing. An example would be the first big tranche of industrial relations. It got to a point where I thought it was in a pretty good space, and I said to them, well, if you're happy to legislate an economic inclusion advisory committee, which will give advice before every budget on the state of our social security system and what needs to be done there, then I'm happy to back this legislation, because whilst it helps workers, it does nothing for people who are out of work between jobs. And I saw that as a way to, every year before the budget, actually have a conversation about our social security system, our safety net, the inadequacy, the gross inadequacy of it for such a wealthy country. And you could say, that's horse trading. In my mind, that's getting good outcomes for Australians and really trying to embed something so we can have this conversation every year. And there's been a bunch of other pieces of legislation where I've done similar things, often related. And I guess it is a lot about compromise and being pragmatic, and some people don't like that. And my sense has been, particularly on the big contentious stuff, if you can push really hard with sensible things that you're hearing that I think strikes the right balance, you land in this spot where 90% of people you meet on the street say, hey, I may not have liked that one thing, but I think it ended up pretty well. And then the 5% on the extreme left and extreme right, you're getting really awful abusive emails from, and you kind of think, well, probably landed in a pretty good spot with this one, if you can strike that balance.
Well, I mean, you think about it, common ground is finding what we share in common, what we value, the principles and things like that. And finding consensus is not everyone's going to get 100% of what they want. It's actually finding out what we can work on together because of the diverse nature of things and people and their experiences. So I sometimes wonder if the world, has got so binary, so black and white, that everything should be this or that, rather than actually looking into the grey. And actually finding that that's actually where we can flourish as a community, when we actually work collectively together to find what we can all live with.
I think it's a real worry if you look at some of the tactics that are being used in politics to really try and divide us because we have so much more in common than our differences. The differences are important, but I think we can't lose sight of just how much we have in common as Australians. And one of the things I really enjoy around big contentious piece of legislation is holding round tables where you actually have people from both sides who are slinging mud at each other in the media, and you get everyone into the same room to talk about an issue, and you actually realise that there's this big sort of agreement, and then there's these differences on each side, and if you can actually start talking more about the things you agree on, you can head towards a place where everyone's saying, well, okay, I can actually live with this. It's not everything I want, as you said, but I can live with this. And I think for a lot of policy areas, that's often a pretty good place to land.
Yeah, and I think, look, from sound bites and stuff in media, it's easy to get people's attention with this black and white approach rather than actually the grey, and allowing people the opportunity to see that actually any relationship of any kind, that's where the good work happens. So I think it's important that we're exposing all of this to the sunlight so that everyone can actually see how we actually work effectively together to find better policy outcomes and a future for Australia. Mon, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions the public actually has about the Senate, how the Senate works, especially in relation to minority governments and crossbench and cross-party collaboration?
Well, of course, we've always, people worry that the crossbench will slow things down, that there'll be a handbrake on things, that there's, I think, sometimes a perception that the crossbench can be a bit fringe, and because the Senate, the nature of the Senate and voting to it is such that you do sometimes, you're obviously there, well, historically at least, I guess, there's probably been more single individuals and some very small parties in the Senate than in the House. Obviously, perhaps, I guess that's changed now. But, there is, and it's going to be an issue for us in the House as well, that the opposition is going to say that a minority government after the next election would be something that would slow things down, stop things from happening. That the obvious response to that, I went into a friend this morning who saw the play Joya last night, who was saying how there was a spontaneous burst of applause when the point was made during that play that the Gillard government got more pieces of legislation across than any other Australian government ever, even though it was a minority government. And I think that is, the point that we will make and the Senate, our Senate colleagues will make as well before the next election. But I think there is that sort of, it's a misconception that things can be slowed down or that the Senate can be a place where there is bad behaviour. And let's face it, on the TV we see the people behaving badly. It's good TV, so that is what tends to get elevated. But as David said, the reality is that much of the time, whether we're in committees or in other settings, we work well and pragmatically and calmly with our colleagues from all sides. And that will always be the case, I think, while people are there for the right reasons, which the vast majority of us are.
We've got roughly 10 or so minutes to go, and I've got a couple of questions that that's been shared with me. But I have a final question for you both. As we've been referring to in this sort of politically polarised climate, how can we actually reassure the public that collaboration and compromise aren't signs of weakness, but are actually essential tools for effective governance and achieving positive outcomes for all Australians?
Dave, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think everyone knows from their own lives that when you're living with people, when you're part of a community, it is about having respectful conversations, disagreeing, finding common ground, compromising to get outcomes. No one can have everything that they want. And I think Australians recognise that. What we need to do is to really make the case, and I guess as independents actually live that and show how it can be done, that you can have people in politics that are genuinely there to serve their community and do that and bring that understanding and that approach and that knowledge. I mean, I'm so aware of the fact that every time I vote in the Senate, that's not my vote. I'm voting on behalf of people in the ACT. I'm accountable to them. I work for them. And so, it's on me to get out, to be accessible, to be listening, and I think that changes the dynamics in politics. When you're fighting for your community and you're standing up for them, not I'm ambitious and I want to climb the party ladder and hopefully one day become a minister and who knows, maybe the prime minister. As an independent, this is as good as it gets, and I'm very happy with that and really enjoying it.
Super, thank you. Mon, what do you think?
I think it's a time of great social division and uncertainty. I think people are anxious and angry and worried, and in demonstrating an ability to work calmly and effectively, pragmatically and collaboratively in the House and in the Senate, we can provide the sort of example, I guess, that people do respond to. It might be that, that the 30-second grab on the news is always going to be the person who's screaming and throwing things and calling each other names. But I actually really think that most people want to be represented by people who are trying to sensibly, collaboratively work for good. And that is something that I think the crossbench will always aspire to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, got a couple of minutes left and I've got a couple of questions from the floor. So I'll just throw them to you both and please feel free to respond. Clearly, people recognise that fighting the good fight must be a bit exhausting. So how do you stop burning out is a question that's been posed.
If someone knows the answer to that question, I'd be really grateful if they could let me know.
David, any comments about that? Well, I've got a couple of others, but just thought I'd
well, I mean, my staff are incredible. My team is, honestly, I'm in awe of how much work they put in, and for me, that's the bigger worry: is how do you sort of keep such committed people from burning out? We try and sort of, it's very hard to strike a balance. I guess personally, I try and at least have a morning or weekend off, and we'll duck off to the Murrumbidgee River and look for platypus and just kind of get away. To me, that's actually, we found this incredible spot where we've seen platypus basically every weekend for the last couple of years. And I don't know, for me, that's a good recharge and just a reminder for how incredible this place is, and there's so much worth looking after and fighting for.
Well, as someone who leads teams of volunteers and things like that, it's so important that you have great people around you, because the work that you do for us is so incredibly important. And as you said, you're representing us. So I'm putting a call out to everyone on this, call today on this. We need more volunteers. We need people to step in, because there's lots of talent out there too that obviously provides that buffer and support for you. One of the questions here too is, if the independents do have balance of power in the next government, will you be able to ask for additional staff numbers, seeing as they were cut? Fingers crossed. So we won't answer that. We'll just say, but okay. Here's how I live. If you never ask, the answer's always no. So ask clearly. We'll see what happens there. So, okay. Are you finding the media is getting more informed and sympathetic to independence over time?
I can actually answer that, because members of my team and I had a really interesting conversation with some media representatives earlier this week at something we attended. I won't say who or where, but what was really interesting was that the question was raised about that, because we said, look, we get a third of the votes. We don't get a third of the attention. You give so much attention to Peter Dutton because, he's the leader of the opposition. But let's face it, cumulatively, we got as many votes as the LNP at the last election. And they said, that's because he's the alternative leader. It's like, I'm not sure that works. I think actually we are getting more of a listening to. But part of it is because the media want to fill airtime or fill newspaper pages, and then they haven't until the last few weeks at least been getting a whole lot of policy or a whole lot of content from the other side, whereas we have come up with ideas and suggestions and useful things for people to talk about. And so I think over time it has changed a bit. I wouldn't say that it's less slanted than it has been in the past, but I think we probably are getting a little bit more of a listening to than we did at least 2 or 3 years ago.
David, any final comments before we wrap up?
I mean, I found one of the big challenges is when you're campaigning as an independent, trying to sort of break in and actually get someone like the ABC to cover independence. You know, they're very focused on kind of their quota of, you know, minutes for Labor, minutes for the opposition, which candidate haven't we heard from? And so that is a challenge. I guess now being based in Canberra and the press gallery here, so I'll do as much media as I can, because I think there's value in actually, I guess, being able to comment and push for things that are important to people in the ACT. And there's a lot of issues that we hear from people on, and so I want to be able to talk about them.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to time. I want to thank you both very much for your valuable contribution to today, but also to our country. We're getting lots of comments about deep gratitude for your work, that you are inspiring other people to step up and create a multiplying effect. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you very much to CIP for putting this on, and we'll see you out there on the ground and doing great work. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Mon.
Thanks so much.
Everyone.